Here's my 1984 excerpt, and here is the language text I'll be using. Here's proof that my desk only includes the papers and my phone as a timer. Here are the I/O nodes I'm allowed to use. This is the IB Language and Literature Individual Oral. Today, I'll be analyzing the impact of government manipulation of history on people. In addition, I'll be taking a look at how and why authors communicate the purpose of a government in controlling its people. The literature text I'll be using is 1984 by George Orwell. 1984 is a dystopian novel which George Orwell used as a warning about the degree of power and control totalitarian governments can maintain. In addition, he used the novel to warn people about the threats a totalitarian government imposed on society. The non-literary text I'll be using is an article by British journalist and author Eric Fish. The article was published in 2019 on time.com, and it's called Chinese Millennials, Tiananmen Shaped China's History. The article condemns, the author's purpose from the article is to condemn the Chinese government for their manipulation of people, of Chinese people, and to observe the government's methods of censorship of the Tiananmen Square massacre from the Chinese people. The first text I'll be starting with is 1984. A factor worth noting is that all the devices included in the passage I'll be analyzing give the reader insight into the confusion present within the minds of people in the novel, and in Winston's mind specifically. Furthermore, the novel is written through a third-person narration by Orwell, which revolves around the main character Winston's perspective. The third-person narration provides very reliable information, and it gives us insight into what the world is like during the party's reign. For example, it tells us about doublethink and the dystopian nature of the society under the party's regime. The first idea I'll be starting with is the confusion that rewriting history presents. Through an anecdote of Winston's thoughts and experiences as a child, when the narration provides information about how Oceania was at war with Eurasia and in alliance with East Asia. In addition, present within this line is alliteration. The alliteration between Eurasia and East Asia provides confusion to the reader and to Winston and to the people in the novel. By making people confused, the party is able to maintain control over the people. In addition, when Winston questions if it was 1984, it's evident that people in the novel under the party's regime are kept ignorant. And that plays a role in giving the party more power over being able to control people. This is because when people are ignorant, they can't think for themselves, and as a result, the party can keep order and control because people can't protest against the party. The second idea I'll be taking a look at is the fear imposed by the party. Because the party is rewriting history, it forces people into a certain case of fear to keep them under control as well. And this is evident in the author's use of diction when he says it was more terrifying than mere torture and death, which he also employs a rhetorical question in that line to show the severe effects and the severe fear imposed on people by the party. When people are afraid, they can easily follow what they're told. In an earlier line, Orwell writes that the enemy of the moment always represented absolute evil. The party uses people's hate and targets it at the enemy, so that the only love people can have is to Big Brother, and hence they are only loyal to Big Brother. The final idea I'll be taking a look at is the concept of doublethink. Doublethink involves thinking of two contradicting ideas. Through that process, people are kept confused. A quote that supports that is when Orwell writes, his mind slid away into the labyrinthine world of doublethink. Through his use of diction, Orwell shows and illustrates the complexity of doublethink and how it puts people into confusion. A significant part of the passage is when the author writes, who controls the past, controls the future, who controls the present, controls the past. Present within the party slogan is parallel structure and the repetition of control. Control is repeated because that's the party's main goal. Its main goal is to maintain and retain control over all people. And to further clarify the slogan, because the party can control and rewrite history, it can control what people are currently thinking in the present. As a result, it can control people's actions in the future. Another passage that effectively demonstrates the global issue, which is the impact of rewriting history on people, is the passage with the airplane. Winston is thinking about the airplane and how the party is saying that it is how the party is saying and illustrating that it invented the airplane. However, Winston remembers from the time before the party took on its regime, remembers that airplanes existed. However, Julia, who was younger than Winston, strongly believes that the party invented planes because due to the age gap between Julia and Winston, the author is conveying that the party can governments and the party can easily control younger generations who are born into the regime of the government and don't know anything about the past or what life was like before the party. Hence, the only information they know is what they are fed by the party. The second text discussing the Tiananmen Square event is also very significant. Something worth noting Something worth noting is that the author uses the text and uses Tiananmen Square as an example of an and uses Tiananmen Square to investigate a real-life example of the impact of totalitarianism on people, because it exists in China. The first idea I'll be analyzing is how China is enforcing the forgetting of the event. This is evident when the author writes, the blood on Beijing streets had barely dried before the state-enforced forgetting began. Through the use of visual imagery, the author is demonstrating the corruption of the government because it's killing its own people. In addition, the irony in this quote is resembled around the enforced forgetting because the government can't enforce a forgetting of something. Hence, it uses methods of fear. When people are kept in fear, they can be easily kept under control. And an evidence for the fear the Chinese government imposes is that when people bring up the Tiananmen Square event in public, they are often harassed, intimidated, or detained. As a result, people around them know that they should stay silent and they are facing a case of fear from the government. The next idea I'll be discussing involves an anecdote from an interview of the author with a Chinese teenager. The Chinese teenager says that things look different once it becomes history. That student is a teenager who lives in China, and the quote and line are very effective because the author uses quotations. Because the author uses quotations, he provides more authenticity to what Chinese people really think. This line has two significant purposes. First of all, it's conveying how the government is changing history, how the government has power to rectify history and past information. In addition, it's depicting how the government manipulates people by keeping people nationalists, and by strengthening people's nationalism. They strengthens people's loyalty to their government, and hence they won't protest against the government, and the government can stay in control and in power. The final idea I'll be discussing is when the author writes is the author's critical tone of the Chinese government. The author is condemning the Chinese government for its manipulation throughout the text, and he's criticizing how they rewrite history. Another article from the author's body of work discusses an issue similar to Tiananmen event. During the Tiananmen event, there was an incident known as the Tank Man, where a Chinese person just stood in front of a tank to stop its progress. What happened? What the author investigates in this article is what Chinese people who are not living in China think about that. For example, he interviews a Chinese person living in an American state, and he asks them about that issue. And then he brings up that there's a Tank Man statue in California. However, the Tank Man statue doesn't exist in China, and the government meant to do that. because it's not telling people about Tiananmen Square. And because the government is not telling people about Tiananmen Square, and it's not recognizing the protesters' efforts in order to change and take down the government. However, the government does consider the death of the protesters as collateral damage. This is because they use it to signify the protest as a cause for improving the government after the massacre. And that's what they force teenagers to think. To conclude, both texts effectively communicate why governments seek to control their people. And it's because they can maintain more power over a people, and that makes it easier to manipulate a people. In 1984, Winston is aware of the government's manipulation, while in China, people aren't. In both texts, through both texts, we get insight both into how people in both situations, or in the novel and in real life in China, don't know what's real and what's fake based on what the government is feeding their minds. In addition, both texts signify and ap- appeal the idea of how younger generations are easier to control because they are already born into lies.